From the outside, Sarah and Michael Bennett looked like the kind of couple others quietly envied. Their house, a neat two-story colonial on a tree-lined street, was the sort of place where neighbors waved on their morning walks and children biked up and down the sidewalks until the streetlights flickered on. Inside, everything seemed carefully curated. Family portraits framed on the walls, laughter echoing on weekends, the smell of fresh bread or cinnamon rolls drifting from the kitchen. Sarah had always been good at appearances. She smiled at the right times, hosted polite dinners, and played the role of the supportive wife with an ease that left little room for suspicion. But appearances, she was learning, were as fragile as glass. Behind her husband's easy charm and sharp suits lay something harder, colder. Michael was admired in town, the successful financial advisor who always found time for charity events. To Sarah, he was still the man she had married 15 years ago, though sometimes she wondered if she had ever truly known him. His kindness now felt rehearsed, his affection measured like water from a leaking tap. She would catch herself staring at him across the dinner table, his broad shoulders, the smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a strange thought would wedge into her mind. There is something missing. Something I can't name. One evening, after the dishes were cleared and their teenage daughter Emily had gone upstairs to finish homework, Sarah tried to reach across that invisible distance. "Do you ever feel," she asked carefully, "like we're drifting? Like there's a wall between us?" Michael didn't look up from his tablet. His jaw tightened before he smoothed it into a faint smile. "You worry too much, Sarah, we're fine. People would kill for what we have." The dismissal landed like a slap, though his tone had been gentle. Sarah pressed her lips together, nodding, though the hollowness in her chest only deepened. That night she lay awake long after Michael's steady breathing filled the room. The moonlight cut sharp lines across his face, turning his expression into something distant, almost unfamiliar. Why does it feel like I'm sleeping beside a stranger? Days blurred into weeks, each one painted with the same routine. Michael leaving early, returning late, Emily's laughter echoing through the halls, Sarah playing the perfect hostess at neighborhood gatherings. Yet beneath the surface she carried a growing unease she could not shake. One Sunday, while she folded laundry in their bedroom, Sarah overheard Michael speaking on the phone in his study downstairs. His voice, normally calm and clipped, was low and urgent. "I told you already, not here, never here." Her hands froze over the fabric in her lap. By the time she crept to the staircase, the door to his study was shut tight. She leaned against the banister, her pulse quickening, and for the first time she admitted to herself that something was wrong. Later that evening, as Michael wrapped an arm around her shoulders while they watched television, Sarah forced herself to relax against him. His warmth pressed into her, yet she felt no comfort. She wondered if he noticed how stiff she had become, how her smile faltered when his lips brushed her temple. Outwardly, they were still perfect, the model family everyone admired. But Sarah now carried a silent burden, a whisper of doubt that she could no longer ignore. In her mind, the image of that locked study door burned brightly, a barrier not just of wood and steel, but of secrets. And Sarah, though not yet ready to confront it, knew instinctively that behind it lay the answer to the coldness that haunted her nights. It would only be a matter of time before her curiosity turned into action. The house always seemed to breathe differently when Sarah was alone. On a gray Saturday morning, with Michael at the office and Emily at a friend's sleepover, the silence pressed against her ears as she carried a basket of laundry down into the basement. The basement smelled faintly of concrete and old wood, dust clinging to the air. As she stacked folded blankets on a shelf, Sarah's eyes wandered. It was then she noticed it again, the small door on the far side of the wall. Heavy, reinforced, with a brass lock that gleamed even under dim light. She had seen it before, of course. But this time, her gaze lingered. It was odd how clean the area around it remained compared to the rest of the basement. No cobwebs, no dust, as if someone took care to preserve it. She set the basket down and approached slowly, her fingertips brushing the cool metal of the handle. It rattled firmly against the lock. Why keep this locked? What's he hiding down here? The thought lodged in her chest like a stone. She crouched, studying the hinges, even the faint scratch marks on the wood. She felt like an intruder in her own home. That evening, after Michael returned, Sarah decided to risk the question. "I noticed the basement door today," she said carefully while they prepared dinner. "The one that's always locked." Michael's knife paused over the cutting board. Just for a second, a flicker so small that most wouldn't notice. But Sarah did. Then he smiled, his voice smooth. "Oh, that old thing. Just storage. Tools, broken appliances. Nothing interesting." He slid the knife through the onion with practiced ease. "Trust me, you're not missing much." Sarah forced a laugh, though unease prickled her skin. "Then why keep it locked?" Michael set down the knife and leaned toward her, brushing her cheek with his hand. His smile widened, affectionate but condescending. "Because, darling, you worry too much. I don't want Emily wandering in and hurting herself. That's all." His tone was light, but it carried a quiet finality. Sarah nodded, swallowing the words she wanted to say. Later that night, when Michael kissed her goodnight, she kept her eyes closed longer than usual, pretending to sleep. Inside, her mind replayed the hesitation in his movements, the flicker in his eyes. She thought of the brass lock gleaming in the basement's dim light. The memory clung to her. The next morning, Sarah descended into the basement again under the pretense of fetching a box. She stood before the locked door, staring, her breath visible in the cool air. She tried the handle once more, firm, unyielding. A sliver of resolve slid into her heart. For the first time, she wondered if she had married a man she truly didn't know. She turned away when she heard Michael's footsteps above, her pulse quickening. Whatever lay behind that door, she realized, was not meant for her eyes. But curiosity is patient, it waits, and Sarah's unease was only just beginning. 2 days passed since Sarah had confronted Michael about the locked door, but the unease never left her chest. Every time she descended into the basement for laundry or supplies, her eyes flicked toward that brass lock, polished like a warning. Then on a windy Thursday afternoon, something arrived that shifted everything. Sarah carried in the mail as usual, bills, flyers, a catalog. But tucked between them was a plain white envelope. No return address, no stamp. It had been slipped directly into the mailbox. Her pulse quickened. She sat at the kitchen table, sliding her finger beneath the flap. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. "You don't know who your husband really is. Be careful. The truth is locked away. For your sake, don't ignore it." Sarah's breath caught. The words trembled on the page, not just from the pen, but from the urgency of whoever had written them. She read them 3 times, her hands growing colder with each pass. Who would write this? Why now? She folded the paper quickly, shoving it back into the envelope just as Michael's car pulled into the driveway. For a brief second, she considered leaving it on the counter, letting him see. But instinct screamed otherwise. Instead, she slid the letter into a cookbook on the shelf, spine creaking as it swallowed the secret. When Michael entered, loosening his tie, his eyes swept the kitchen. "Everything all right?" Sarah forced a smile. "Just the usual bills." He kissed her cheek lightly before moving to the fridge. But she caught the flicker of his gaze as it lingered on the stack of mail, as if he were searching for something. That night, Sarah lay awake, the words of the letter whispering through her head. "You don't know who your husband really is." She thought of the locked basement door, the pause in Michael's voice, the way his smile often felt like a mask stretched too tight. The next morning, once Michael left for work, Sarah pulled out the letter again. She studied the handwriting carefully, uneven, hurried, almost desperate. She traced her fingers over the indentation of the pen strokes, as though she could feel the panic of the writer. She decided she couldn't ignore it. Her first step was small. She drove to the town library, heart hammering as though she were doing something illegal. Sitting at a dusty table, she began searching through old newspaper archives. She typed in Michael's last name, Bennett. The results sprawled across the screen: weddings, business articles, charity events. All the pieces of the perfect life Michael had carefully constructed. But Sarah kept scrolling, deeper into older records. Nothing yet. A librarian glanced her way and Sarah quickly minimized the screen, pretending to check her phone. Paranoia crept over her, as if someone were watching her dig into a story better left untouched. Back home, Sarah tucked the letter deeper into a hidden drawer in her vanity. She knew telling Michael was impossible. The man she had married might dismiss it with laughter or charm. But another part of her feared what he would do if he knew she was questioning him. That evening, as they sat together at dinner with Emily chatting about school, Sarah's smile remained fixed. But inside, her mind was elsewhere. Every word Michael spoke, every glance he cast, she now weighed against the letter's warning. Michael noticed. "You're quiet tonight," he said, cutting into his steak. "Just tired," Sarah replied softly. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, probing, suspicious. Then he nodded, returning to his plate. Later, Sarah stood by the window as the wind rattled the branches outside. She whispered the words of the letter under her breath, tasting their truth. "You don't know who your husband really is. The house, once warm, now felt like a stage set. Perfect walls, perfect furniture, perfect family, hiding something rotten underneath, and deep inside." Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The warning letter never left Sarah's thoughts. Every time she looked at Michael, the words bled through her mind like a stain she couldn't scrub away. "You don't know who your husband really is." She tried to act normal, but Michael noticed the shift. His gaze seemed sharper now, watching her longer than before. One evening, as she reached for her phone, he casually asked, "Who have you been texting so much lately?" Sarah froze. "Just Emily's teacher. Why?" Michael smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No reason. I just like knowing who my wife is talking to." The words were soft, almost affectionate, but something beneath them felt wrong, like a leash tightening around her throat. The change came gradually. Michael began calling Sarah throughout the day. Not just once, but 3, sometimes 4 times. If she missed a call, his tone hardened when she returned it. "Where were you?" he would ask, voice clipped. "Just at the store," she'd answer, heart racing. "I thought you said you were staying home today." It sounded like concern. It felt like surveillance. Their arguments grew sharper, the once subtle jabs now venom-tipped. One night, Sarah suggested hiring a babysitter so she could meet a friend for coffee. Michael's fork clattered against his plate. "And leave Emily with a stranger?" "Absolutely not." "It's just for an hour," Sarah pressed. Michael leaned back, his jaw tight. "If you need company so badly, I'll come with you. But you don't go anywhere without me." Not anymore. The air between them thickened. Sarah didn't argue further, but her silence screamed louder than any words. In the quiet moments after these fights, Michael's charm returned. Apologies laced with flowers, promises whispered against her hair. "I only worry because I love you," he said, his arms tightening around her shoulders. But the embrace felt less like comfort and more like a cage. At night, Sarah lay awake listening to Michael's breathing beside her, steady and controlled. She replayed his words, his moods, his sudden flashes of temper. The basement door haunted her thoughts, as did the hidden letter. What if Michael somehow knew about it? Once while tidying the bedroom, she noticed the drawer where she'd hidden the letter slightly ajar. Panic surged. Had she left it open, or had Michael been there? She searched quickly. The letter was still there, but the possibility of discovery clung to her like static. The tension spilled into Emily's world, too. Their daughter, once carefree, now picked up on the sharp edges in the air. "Mommy, why do you and Daddy fight so much?" she whispered one evening. Sarah forced a smile, brushing Emily's hair back. "We're just tired, sweetheart. Everything's fine, but nothing felt fine anymore." The house, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. Even mundane conversations turned into minefields. "Did you use my laptop?" Michael asked one morning. "No, why?" "Because the browser history looks different." Sarah swallowed hard. She hadn't touched his laptop, but the accusation sliced deep. She realized then that Michael was watching her closely, closer than ever. Their marriage had transformed into a shadowed performance, each playing roles while hiding their true thoughts. Sarah's suspicion gnawed at her, while Michael's control grew like vines tightening around her every move. The cracks in their picture-perfect life were no longer hairline fractures. They were fault lines, widening with every passing day, and deep inside, Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before something snapped. That night, as rain lashed against the windows, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. Her reflection in the dark glass looked foreign, hollow-eyed, exhausted. She whispered to herself, almost a vow, "I have to know the truth. Before it's too late." Unseen, the shadows lengthened around her, the silence of the house pressing in. The stage was set for revelations that would rip the facade of their marriage wide open. The storm inside Sarah's marriage had become a constant hum, a tension that followed her like a shadow. At home, Michael's grip seemed to tighten with every passing day, his watchful eyes never leaving her. At work, she found brief reprieve until the day a stranger stepped into her world and shattered what little peace she had left. It was a Tuesday morning at the small community library where Sarah worked part-time. The building smelled faintly of dust and coffee, the kind of place where silence had its own texture. She was shelving books when she noticed him, a man lingering near the genealogy section, his posture stiff, his eyes flicking toward her every few minutes. At first, she thought little of it. Plenty of patrons came searching for family histories, but when she glanced back again, he was closer, studying her face in a way that made her skin prickle. Finally, he approached. His voice was low, urgent. "You're Sarah Bennett, right?" Her heart skipped. "Yes, can I help you?" The man looked around the library as though checking for ears. He was older than Michael by at least a decade, with tired eyes and a jaw shadowed in stubble. "You don't know me, but I know your husband." Sarah's blood turned cold. "Excuse me?" He leaned in, his words barely above a whisper. "Michael isn't who you think he is. He's tied to something dark, a crime. And if you stay close to him, you'll be destroyed too." Sarah's instinct screamed to step back, to dismiss him as a lunatic. But the certainty in his tone rattled her. Her pulse hammered as she forced a tight smile. "I think you're mistaken." "I'm not." The man's hand trembled slightly as he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "There are records, names, I can't say more here. But believe me, Mrs. Bennett, you need to be careful." He placed the paper on the counter, then turned and walked out, his figure swallowed by the glass doors before Sarah could even ask his name. She stood frozen, the paper burning like fire in her hands that evening. Sarah sat in her car long after work, the folded page resting on the passenger seat. She hadn't dared open it yet. The fear was too sharp, the possibilities too vast. What if it's true? Her mind conjured Michael's controlling stares, his obsession with the locked basement door, his constant monitoring. The memory of the anonymous note from weeks earlier rose unbidden, its words echoing. "You don't know who your husband really is." 2 warnings, from 2 different sources. She unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. Inside was a name she didn't recognize, a year scribbled beside it. 1998. And the words "unsolved homicide" underlined twice. That night at dinner, Sarah could barely lift her fork. Michael noticed instantly. "You're quiet," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Just tired," she whispered. Michael reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. The gesture should have been tender, but to Sarah it felt like a reminder of his power. "You know you can tell me anything," he said softly. "No secrets between us." The irony clawed at her throat. She forced a nod, hiding the paper deep in her purse as though its mere presence might betray her. Lying awake in bed, Sarah replayed the man's face, the urgency in his eyes. Who was he? Why warn me? The questions consumed her until dawn, when she rose with the decision gnawing at her chest. She needed answers, no matter the cost, but answers would mean digging into Michael's past, a past he had fought carefully to conceal. As the first light of morning seeped through the curtains, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the paper spread before her like forbidden scripture. She whispered to herself, voice barely audible, "What have you done, Michael?" The echo of that question lingered in the silence, a promise of storms yet to come and far away. The stranger who had spoken to her knew. His warning had planted a seed that could no longer be ignored. The paper the stranger had left her gnawed at Sarah's conscience like a worm burrowing into wood. She couldn't let it go. Not the name, not the year, not the words "unsolved homicide." Days passed, and she moved through her home like a ghost, her mind obsessively circling back to what it could mean. Michael, meanwhile, seemed to sense her distance. His attempts at affection had grown sharper, edged with suspicion. "You've been distracted," he said one night, his voice low as they sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp. "Anything you want to tell me?" Sarah forced a smile. "Just work." His eyes lingered on her too long, probing. Then he nodded, but something in his expression chilled her. A flicker of calculation. The next afternoon, when Michael left for a client meeting, Sarah seized her chance. She drove across town to the county records office, her heart hammering as though she were committing a crime. The room was sterile, rows of dusty files and humming microfiche machines. Sarah clutched the slip of paper with the scrawled name, Thomas R. Bennett. She approached the clerk, her voice barely steady. "I'm looking for court records from the late 90s, she said. "Murder investigations, if possible." The clerk raised an eyebrow, but led her to a drawer of case files. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through them, stopping when the name leapt off the page. Thomas R. Bennett, suspect. She sat at a metal table, unfolding the file as though it were radioactive. The reports painted a grim picture, a violent altercation in a rural house, a young man dead from blunt force trauma, witnesses placing Thomas, Michael's father, at the scene. Arrests were made, questions asked, but the case had dissolved. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. And there, buried in the footnotes, was a detail that made Sarah's stomach knot. A teenage boy had been present that night. His name, Michael Bennett. The words swam before her eyes. Sarah closed the file, her hands clammy. Michael had been there. Not just as a witness. He was listed as someone who helped account for timelines. In other words, his testimony had protected his father. She stumbled out of the records office into the blinding daylight, struggling to breathe. He lied. He's lied all along. That evening, Sarah couldn't keep her hands still as she cooked dinner. Michael noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You're fidgety," he said, his fork scraping the plate. "Just tired," she muttered. Michael tilted his head, watching her like a predator studying prey. "You sure?" She nodded, but inside panic roared. She knew now what the locked basement door, the evasions, the sharpness in his tone really meant. Michael had been groomed by secrets his whole life. He had learned deceit from his father, learned how to bury truth under charm and control. Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed, Sarah crept into his study. The floor creaked beneath her weight, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. She approached the locked drawer again, fingers grazing the smooth wood. Something inside her whispered, "The truth is here." She crouched, pulling at the handle in vain, her frustration mounting. Then her eyes drifted upward to the bookshelves. One volume stuck out slightly, thicker than the rest. She tugged it free, and a small brass key slipped out, clattering onto the desk. Her heart seized. With trembling hands, she slid it into the drawer's lock. The click was deafening. Inside were photographs yellowed with age, grainy images of crime scene tape, a blood-stained floor, the face of the victim from 1998, and beneath them, a police transcript with Michael's teenage statement. Her hands shook violently as she read, "My father was with me the entire time. He didn't touch the boy, but the timeline didn't fit. Witnesses had placed Thomas elsewhere. Michael had lied." Sarah pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle the sob rising in her throat. This wasn't just his father's crime, it was his too. He had built their life together on a foundation of blood and betrayal. The sound of a floorboard creaking made her freeze. "Sarah?" Michael's voice floated down the hall. She shoved the papers back into the drawer, locked it with frantic hands, and slid the key onto the bookshelf just as he entered the room. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette cutting sharp against the dim light. His eyes darted to the desk, then back to her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, but there was steel under his words. Sarah forced a smile, her chest aching with the effort. "Just looking for a book." Michael's gaze lingered. Then slowly he smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he said. "You should get some rest." As Sarah lay awake beside him later, the weight of the revelation crushed her. The man she loved had been forged in violence, his hands stained with the lies that had shielded a killer. And worse, he had carried that secret into their marriage, molding their lives into a cage she could no longer escape. But somewhere deep inside, resolve flickered. She would not let his family's sins bury her too. What she didn't know was that Michael was already watching her more closely than ever, aware that his carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. Michael had grown sharper in his attention, like a spotlight she could never step out of. Sarah felt it in the way his eyes followed her, in the way his questions came too quickly, too rehearsed, as if he were testing her answers for cracks. One evening, as she folded laundry in the bedroom, he appeared suddenly in the doorway. "You've been distant," he said. His voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "I'm just tired," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes on the shirts in her lap. Michael crossed the room slowly, crouching in front of her. He lifted her chin with his finger until their eyes met. "No, it's more than that. I can feel you pulling away." His gaze bore into her. For a moment, Sarah thought he might see everything. The letters, the files, the truth she had unearthed. Her heart thundered. "I'm fine," she whispered. Michael chuckled softly, kissing her forehead. "You don't lie well, Sarah. That's one of the reasons I love you." The word love landed like a chain around her neck. The next morning, she found her phone sitting on the kitchen counter where she hadn't left it. When she unlocked it, her call log had been cleared. "Did you touch my phone?" she asked. Michael, seated at the table with his coffee, raised an eyebrow. "Why would I?" Her pulse quickened. "Because it wasn't where I left it," he smirked. "Maybe you're forgetting things again. You've been scattered lately." The subtle accusation stung. She opened her mouth to protest, but closed it again. Doubt crawled into her chest, whispering that maybe he was right. Maybe she had been losing track. Days blurred into nights, and Michael's behavior grew increasingly erratic. One moment he would berate her for leaving a light on, his voice sharp and punishing. The next he would draw her into his arms, murmuring apologies, stroking her hair. "I just worry about you," he would say, holding her close. "You've been fragile lately. I need to take care of you." But his embrace felt like a cage. Sarah began to keep a journal, scrawling notes late at night in the bathroom with the water running to mask the sound. "He moved my phone. He rewrote history. He tells me I imagined things." And yet sometimes when Michael leaned close and whispered, "You're the only person I've ever trusted," she would feel herself unravel. His words tangled with her fear until she no longer knew what was truth and what was his invention. The breaking point came during dinner one night. Emily had gone to bed and Sarah reached for a glass of wine. Michael caught her wrist midair. "You've been drinking more than usual," he said flatly. Her eyes widened. "That's not true, isn't it?" "You finished a whole bottle last week by yourself." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't, she was sure she hadn't. But his certainty was crushing, relentless. "Michael, He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "You're not well, Sarah. You're starting to worry me." She froze, the room tilting around her. The terrifying part wasn't just his words. It was the way a small, poisonous doubt bloomed inside her. What if he's right? What if I really am unraveling? That night, as she lay awake beside him, Sarah stared at the ceiling, every breath tight in her chest. Michael's arm draped possessively over her waist, warm and heavy. In the darkness, she realized the most dangerous weapon he wielded wasn't violence or threats. It was his love, twisted and sharp-edged, blurring the line between devotion and control until she couldn't tell them apart. And as Sarah closed her eyes, one truth settled like ice in her veins. If she couldn't find her own clarity soon, she might never escape the world Michael was building around her. The house had grown quieter in recent weeks. Sarah moved like a shadow through its rooms, her mind tangled in Michael's contradictions, her spirit eroded by doubt. But it wasn't only her who noticed the unease that clung to the air. Emily, perceptive and restless, felt it too. One rainy afternoon, while her parents were out, Emily wandered into Michael's study. It was a place she had been told countless times to avoid, its shelves stacked with leather-bound books and meticulously arranged papers. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old dust, a smell that both comforted and unsettled her. She ran her fingers along the edge of his desk, pausing when she noticed something odd. The drawer on the right sat flush, but the one on the left had a faint gap. Curiosity tugged at her, and she crouched down. Pulling gently, she found it locked. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't ever go through my things. Emily, some boundaries must be respected, but boundaries," she thought, should not feel like cages. She searched the room, her eyes landing on a small brass key tucked behind a row of books. Heart pounding, she fitted into the drawer. The lock gave with a sharp click. Inside lay a stack of photographs, their edges curled with age. She pulled the first free and froze. A body, pale and lifeless, sprawled on a floor streaked with blood. Police tape in the background. The next photo. A man in handcuffs, his face strikingly familiar. Her grandfather, Emily's breath hitched. Beneath the photos lay documents brittle with time. She scanned them, her eyes widening as she saw her father's name scrawled in youthful handwriting, tied to statements in an old investigation. The words blurred before her eyes, but the implication was clear. Michael had been part of something dark, something hidden for decades. The front door slammed upstairs. Emily jolted, shoving the papers back and locking the drawer with shaking hands. She darted out of the study, her heart racing. That night, when Michael finally drifted into sleep, Emily crept into her mother's room. Sarah sat upright, still awake, her face pale in the glow of the lamp. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I found something." "In Dad's study." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What did you find?" Emily hesitated, then whispered, "Pictures. Of a dead man, and Grandpa, and Dad's name on police papers." Her eyes shone with tears. "Mom, what's going on?" "Who is he?" Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to soothe her daughter's terror, but she couldn't. Not anymore. The walls of lies had grown too thick. She pulled Emily close, her hands trembling against her daughter's hair. "I don't know everything," she admitted softly, voice breaking. "But I know enough to be afraid." Emily's sob pressed against her chest. "He's dangerous, isn't he?" Sarah closed her eyes. "Yes, and we need to be careful." For the first time, Sarah spoke aloud the truth she had been suffocating under. She didn't give Emily the details, not yet, but the weight of confession shifted something inside her. She was no longer alone in her fear. "Promise me," Sarah whispered, gripping Emily's shoulders, "that you'll act normal around him. Don't let him know you've seen anything." Emily nodded quickly, her face pale but resolute. The next morning at breakfast, Michael's eyes swept over the table, sharp and watchful. Sarah forced a smile as she sipped her coffee, but she noticed Emily's hand trembling as she buttered her toast. Michael's gaze lingered on his daughter for a beat too long. Then he smiled, easy and practiced. "Sleep well, sweetheart?" he asked. Emily nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah, Dad, fine." Sarah's heart clenched. She knew now there was no turning back. Michael's carefully guarded secrets had spilled into their daughter's world. The danger was no longer hers alone. It was theirs. That night, Sarah sat by her window, staring into the darkness outside. She felt Emily's words echo in her chest. "Who is he?" The answer was becoming terrifyingly clear. Michael wasn't just a man with shadows in his past. He was a man willing to twist love, truth, and family itself into weapons. And Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before those weapons turned against them. The house had become a stage of silence, every word and movement carefully measured. Since Emily's discovery, Sarah lived with the knowledge that her daughter now shared the burden of truth. It changed everything. There was no longer room for denial, only survival. That night, Sarah lay awake in the dim bedroom. Michael's even breathing beside her was deceptive, masking the storm she knew churned within him. Each day his temper grew sharper, his eyes more suspicious. He sensed something shifting, even if he couldn't yet name it. Sarah's thoughts circled endlessly until they landed on one desperate idea. She needed proof, something undeniable, words from his own mouth. She retrieved a small recorder she had hidden years earlier, back when Michael's paranoia first began to seep into their lives. Sliding it beneath the nightstand, she whispered a silent prayer. The next evening, tension finally broke. Michael stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed, his movements sharp. Sarah and Emily were finishing dinner when he slammed his fist against the counter, making the plates rattle. "Do you think I don't see it?" His voice was jagged. The whispers, the looks. "You're both against me." Emily's eyes widened in terror, but Sarah steadied her voice. "No one is against you, Michael. You're imagining things." "Imagining?" His laugh was cruel, bitter. "You think I don't know what you've been doing?" "Snooping. Digging into things that should have stayed buried." Sarah's pulse hammered. He was close, so close to spilling everything. "Michael," she said carefully, "you don't need to carry these secrets anymore." The words acted like fuel to fire. His face twisted and he stepped closer, towering over her. "Secrets? You want to talk about secrets? Fine. I've carried the weight of my father's crime for decades. I cleaned up after him. I kept this family's name from being destroyed. And do you know what thanks I get? Suspicion. Betrayal. Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. Every word was being captured. Tell me, she whispered, what did you clean up? Michael's eyes burned. His voice lowered into something dark and unshakable. He killed that man. You know he did. And I made sure no one could ever prove it. I burned the clothes. I lied to the police. I did what I had to do for this family. Sarah's breath caught. The recorder was running. The truth was no longer locked in shadows. But Michael wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice almost a growl. And don't think I wouldn't do it again. If anyone threatens us, if you threaten me, I'll protect myself the same way I always have. Emily gasped, the sound betraying her presence. Michael's head snapped toward her, his expression hardening. What did you hear? His voice was sharp, dangerous. Emily froze, her lips trembling. Nothing. Sarah moved quickly, placing herself between them. She didn't hear anything, Michael. Stop. But Michael's rage had already taken hold. His breathing grew heavy, his fists clenched. You think you can record me? Trap me? You think I don't know? His gaze darted to the corner of the room, his instincts sharp as a predator's. Sarah's stomach dropped. He had sensed the recorder. In a blur, Michael shoved past her, yanking open the nightstand drawer where she had hidden it earlier that week. His hand closed around the device. He lifted it, the tiny red light still blinking. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. His face went pale, then hardened into something unrecognizable. You, he hissed. You betrayed me. Sarah stepped back, her body trembling but her voice steady. You betrayed us long before this, Michael. It's over. We know the truth now. Emily knows. Emily clutched her mother's arm, her eyes wide with fear. Michael's expression contorted between rage and desperation. He smashed the recorder against the wall, shattering it into pieces. But Sarah didn't flinch. The words were still burned into her memory, into Emily's too. The confession could never be destroyed. He lunged suddenly, his hand closing around Sarah's wrist with crushing force. You think you're safe because she knows? Because you both know? His voice rose, filled with a venom that chilled the air. I built this life for us and I'll burn it down before I let you take it from me. Sarah winced under his grip but met his eyes. Then you've already lost. The words struck him like a blow. His grip loosened, but only for a moment. Then, with a roar, he shoved her backward into the table, sending dishes crashing to the floor. Emily screamed, rushing toward her mother. The confrontation had turned violent. The thin line Sarah had walked for years was gone. She scrambled to her feet, pulling Emily behind her, her mind racing. Michael loomed in the doorway, blocking their only escape, his face twisted with fury. In that moment, Sarah realized there was no more hiding, no more pretending. The truth was out, and survival meant fighting back. The kitchen was a battlefield of broken dishes and trembling breaths. Sarah clutched Emily tightly behind her, her back pressed to the counter as Michael loomed in the doorway, his chest heaving with fury. His eyes were wild, caught between betrayal and desperation, a man unraveling before their eyes. Move, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. You don't understand what you've done. Sarah forced her body to stay firm, though her legs shook beneath her. I understand enough, she whispered. You've dragged us into your lies for too long, Michael. It ends tonight. Michael's hand twitched at his side as though he were weighing violence against retreat. Emily sobbed quietly, her fingers digging into Sarah's arm. Stop filling her head with poison, Michael shouted suddenly, pointing at Sarah with shaking rage. You turned her against me. You made her afraid of me. After everything I've done for this family, this is how you repay me. You built this house on blood, Sarah snapped back, surprising even herself with the force in her voice. And now it's bleeding into us. For a moment, Michael froze. Something flickered in his expression, the fragile edge of guilt breaking through his madness. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced with raw, uncontainable rage. He lunged forward. Sarah shoved Emily aside just as Michael grabbed her arm again, twisting it cruelly. She cried out, struggling against him, her free hand reaching blindly across the counter until it landed on the cold handle of a knife. Let go, she screamed, but Michael only tightened his grip, his face inches from hers, spittle flying as he shouted, You don't get to ruin this family. You don't get to ruin me. In that split second, the world collapsed into instinct. Sarah thrust the knife forward. A sharp gasp cut the air. Michael's body jerked, his eyes widening in shock. He staggered backward, his grip loosening, and Sarah stumbled free. For a moment, time stopped. Sarah's chest heaved as she stared in disbelief at the blood blooming across Michael's shirt. The knife slipped from her trembling hand, clattering to the floor. Michael pressed a hand to the wound, his face pale, his breath ragged. "Sarah." His voice was faint, more broken than angry now. "What have you done?" Emily screamed, rushing toward her father, but Sarah pulled her back, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Stay behind me, Emily," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Stay away." Michael stumbled, crashing into the table and sending more dishes shattering to the ground. He tried to steady himself, but his legs buckled, and he collapsed heavily onto the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Blood spread across the tiles, dark and thick, reaching outward in slow, jagged rivers. The kitchen lights reflected in the crimson pool, turning the familiar space into something alien, something grotesque. Emily clung to her mother, sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah's body shook as she tried to steady her breathing, her eyes locked on Michael's fading form. "Call. Help!" Michael gasped, his voice barely audible. His hand twitched weakly toward them, but Sarah stood frozen, torn between the instinct to save him and the crushing reality of what he had become. "Mom!" Emily cried, her voice frantic. "We have to do something." Sarah dropped to her knees beside Michael, pressing her hands against the wound. Blood coated her fingers, warm and slick. "Stay with me," she begged through sobs. "Please, just stay with me." But Michael's eyes had already begun to dim, his breath shallow and uneven. He looked at her one last time, a strange mix of regret and defiance flickering across his face. Then, with a shuddering exhale, his body went still. Sarah froze. Her bloody hands pressed against his lifeless chest. Emily's scream pierced the silence. The room spun around Sarah, the horror of what she had done pressing down with unbearable weight. She wanted to believe she hadn't had a choice, that it was self-defense, that it was survival. But all she could see was the pool of blood widening on the floor, the crimson stain marking the end of her marriage, and the man she once thought she loved. The walls of the house seemed to close in, suffocating with decades of secrets, lies, and now death. The legacy of violence had finally consumed them. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, closer. Someone had called. Maybe a neighbor, maybe fate itself. Sarah clutched Emily tightly, rocking her as the girl wept into her chest. "Innocence is gone," Sarah whispered hoarsely, staring at the blood at her feet. "It's gone for good." As red lights flashed against the windows, painting the room in warning, Sarah knew there was no turning back. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the Bennett home in a surreal glow, turning the quiet suburban street into a stage of tragedy. Neighbors whispered in clusters, their faces pale with disbelief as officers carried Michael's body out on a stretcher. Inside, Sarah sat in handcuffs at the dining table, her hands still stained with his blood. Emily clung to her, shaking silently, her young eyes shattered by what they had witnessed. The investigators moved methodically, snapping photos, gathering evidence, bagging the knife that had ended Michael's life. Every corner of the house felt tainted now, every shadow a witness to the secrets that had poisoned their marriage. When the lead detective, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Ramirez, leaned forward to question Sarah, her tone was both steady and unyielding. "Mrs. Bennett, we need to understand what happened here tonight. Was this self-defense?" Sarah's voice faltered as she tried to explain, her words tumbling out in fragments. He wasn't the man people thought he was. The secrets, his family, the lies. I had no choice. He was going to hurt us." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. It would be the court's decision now, not theirs. Weeks turned into months as Sarah's life was consumed by the slow machinery of justice. The trial was a spectacle, the courtroom packed with reporters and curious onlookers hungry for scandal. The headline, "Perfect Marriage Ends in Blood, Suburban Wife on Trial," spread like wildfire. In court, the prosecution painted Sarah as a woman who snapped, lashing out at a husband who had never raised a hand against her. They emphasized her secrecy, her hidden recording, her calculated thrust of the knife. The photographs of Michael's body on the floor were shown to the jury, and Sarah's stomach churned as the room gasped. But the defense told a different story, a darker one. Witnesses came forward. The stranger who had once warned Sarah testified, revealing Michael's connection to his father's violent past. Old police files were unearthed, showing how Michael's father had evaded justice decades earlier. Though never convicted, the stain of murder had shadowed the Bennett family for years. The most gut-wrenching testimony came from Emily. Trembling on the stand, she recounted the nights of shouting, her father's terrifying outbursts, and the fear she had seen in her mother's eyes. "He wasn't the man everyone thought," Emily whispered through tears. "My mom was trying to protect us." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a confession from the grave. Sarah sat through it all, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale and hollow. She felt both seen and exposed, her private nightmare dissected for strangers to consume. The guilt gnawed at her. She had killed her husband. No matter the circumstances, no matter the secrets uncovered, the truth of that act was undeniable. Yet there was relief. Relief that the cycle of silence had been broken, that Emily would never again live under the suffocating shadow of Michael's control. Relief that the truth, twisted and ugly as it was, had finally crawled into the light. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreman's voice was steady as he read the verdict. Not guilty. A wave of sound rippled through the room. Gasps, murmurs, the scratching of reporters' pens. Sarah closed her eyes, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Emily clutched her hand, her grip fierce as though afraid her mother might disappear. The judge's gavel fell, ending months of torment in a single strike. Later, in a documentary-style narration, Detective Ramirez's voice echoed over slow, haunting shots of the Bennett home. Secrets can destroy more than reputations. They destroy families. The Bennett case showed us how shadows from the past can consume the present, how love can warp into control, and how silence can be as dangerous as violence itself. A family built on secrets will always collapse. The only question is when. Sarah walked free, but she was not unscarred. The trial had cleared her name, but the weight of her actions would follow her for the rest of her life. At night, she still heard Michael's last words, still saw the blood spreading across the floor. Justice had come. But innocence once lost could never be restored. The trial was over. The cameras were gone. The courtroom murmurs had faded into memory, and the Bennett home stood empty, its walls stripped of family photographs, its windows boarded, a monument to a life that had unraveled. Sarah sat in her sister's guest room weeks after the verdict, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts echoing in the silence. She had been found not guilty, but freedom carried its own weight. Every night she replayed the last moments with Michael, the rage in his eyes, the sharpness of his voice, the blood pooling across the polished floorboards. The sound of his final breath haunted her dreams. In the style of a true crime documentary, Sarah's voiceover would carry the scene. They tell you that marriage is about trust, about building a life together. But what happens when trust is poisoned by lies? When the person you love most is also the one you fear? I never thought I'd be the woman who stood in a courtroom, accused of killing her husband. I never thought Emily would have to testify against her own father. But here we are. Life outside the trial was no easier. Sarah found herself a stranger in her own town. Some neighbors looked at her with sympathy, others with suspicion. In the supermarket aisle, whispers followed her. To some, she was the woman who survived a monster. To others, she was simply the wife who killed. Emily tried to move on, throwing herself into school and art. But Sarah could see the scars etched into her daughter's quiet moments, the way she jumped at sudden noises, the way her laughter seemed hollow. Trauma had seeped into the very fabric of their bond, twisting mother and daughter together in grief. Detective Ramirez, in a post-trial interview, summarized it bluntly. The Bennett case reminds us that secrets rot in silence. Michael's family legacy was built on blood and lies, and it swallowed him whole. Sarah may have survived, but survival doesn't mean healing. Justice isn't always clean. It's messy, human, and it always leaves scars. In her private moments, Sarah wrestled with guilt. She questioned every choice. Should she have left earlier? Could she have saved Emily from the courtroom? Was there another way? A way that didn't end with blood on her hands? She began keeping a journal, writing late at night when the house was quiet. The entries read like confessions. I loved him. I feared him. And in the end, I destroyed him. Through the ink, she tried to make sense of the contradictions. How Michael had once been her safe place. How his smile had once lit her world. How love had slowly turned into control, and control into terror. The documentary's closing narration would be chillingly reflective. This was not just the story of Sarah and Michael Bennett. It is the story of every marriage where silence hides secrets, where appearances mask rot, where love and fear become indistinguishable. It leaves us with a haunting question. How well do we really know the person we share a life with? Images would flash across the screen. Family portraits, the Bennett house under police tape, the courtroom sketches, Sarah walking free yet hollow-eyed. Emily's face would linger longest, her gaze both innocent and haunted, a reminder of the collateral damage left behind. One evening, Sarah stood at the edge of a quiet lake with Emily beside her. The water rippled in the twilight, calm and endless. Emily slipped her hand into her mother's, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt a flicker of peace. The past could not be undone. The secrets, the lies, the blood, all of it would echo in their lives forever. But in that silence, mother and daughter chose to keep walking forward. The screen would fade to black, and the final words would appear. Some family secrets die with the past. Others live on, in silence, in shadows, in blood.